Good morning, everyone. Welcome to the Pérez Art Museum Miami. My name is Marie Vickles. I'm the Director of Education, and I'm so pleased to welcome you all to the first convening of the Women Photographers International Archive, WOPHA Congress, entitled Women, Photography, and Feminisms, taking place over the next 2 days at the Pérez Art Museum Miami and also online virtually. Please note that our first panelist today, Marie Roberts, will be presenting in French. Please click on the interpretation tab on the lower right side of your screen next to the Q&A feature if you would like to hear her presentation in English. Translation is available for that in English. Let's get started. So from the very first moment that this program was presented to the museum in early, I believe it was 2019, by Aldeide Delgado, it was immediately evident how important and necessary it was for us to support and ensure that the Congress would take place here in Miami and at the Pérez Art Museum Miami. It is truly a pleasure to see this actually happening after so many challenges and delays that could have easily discouraged a less focused and passionate founder like Latinx art historian and curator Aldeide Delgado. Over the course of the next 2 days, we will create much needed and critical spaces for photography by bringing together worldwide organizations of women photographers, art historians, theorists, and curators who aim to build upon and better represent the dynamic history of women photographers from the 19th century through today. We will also celebrate and connect with one another, as the WOPHA Congress provides an unparalleled network for the international community of women in the photographic arts. A few acknowledgements before I introduce Aldeide. As you can imagine, this type of programming takes an incredible amount of people and teamwork to make it possible. And I would be remiss if I did not thank the team of people at the museum working so very hard to produce our PAMM educational programs. I would like to acknowledge Anita Bram, Associate Director of Adult Programs and Audience Engagement, Alexa Ferra, Director of Marketing and Communications, and our world-class audiovisual team, Denise Faxis and Andrew Bird, with Lázaro Yanes on video and cameras on site at the museum. There are, of course, so many more people to thank, including the incredible group of supporters and advisors from the WOPHA team as well. We literally could not do this without you all. Thank you so much. Now let's get started with an introduction of Women Photographers International Archive WOPHA Founder and Director Aldeide Delgado. Aldeide has a background in advising and presenting at art history forums based on photography, including lectures at the Tate Modern, Pérez Art Museum Miami, the New School, and California Institute of the Arts. Aldeide is a recent recipient of the 2019 Night Arts Challenge, 2018 School of Art Criticism Fellowship, and a 2017 Research and Production of Critic Essay Fellowship. She is the author of the online archive Catalog of Cuban Women Photographers, as well as the namesake ongoing book. Publications where she has contributed to include Cuban Art News, Artishock, Terremoto, Sea and America Latina, Arcadia, as well as diverse independent art blogs. She is also an active member of PAMM's International Women's Committee, IKT International Association of Curators of Contemporary Art, US Latinx Art Forum, and Art Table. So without further ado, please join me in giving a warm welcome to Aldeide Delgado.
Thank you so much, Marie, and thank you to everyone for being here today. Thank you to the PAMM team for all your support for making this event happen during the last 2 years in which we have been working on it. Thank you, of course, for all the collaboration, the advice. Thank you to our main sponsor, Knight Foundation, for all the support from this event as well. It is with extreme pleasure that I welcome you to the world's first ever WOPHA Congress. WOPHA Congress seeks to create a critical space for photography by bringing together worldwide organizations of women photographers, art historians, theorists, and curators who aim to build upon and better represent the dynamic history of women photographers from the 19th century through today. This event presents seminal and emerging research and discourse in the field, considering both national and international discussions about women and feminism in the history of photography. The WOPHA Congress constitutes a platform to celebrate women and provides an unparalleled network for the international community of women in the photographic arts. The category women has worked as an opaque entity that has hidden the privilege of certain groups of women, white, heterosexual, cisgender, middle-class women, above other racialized women and or eccentric subjectivities. By using the term in this context, we recognize that there are different ways to be a woman according to class, race, sexual orientation, age, religion, creed, ability, and gender, and that none of these factors can be left out in considering the totality of cis and trans women's life experiences. According to bell hooks, bodies who experience and are shaped by specific forms of sexual oppression may be socially configured as women. Thus, we understand the category as a political subject whose awareness of historical gender oppression affords them a condition of resistance and struggle. The WOPHA Congress emerged as the next step of my project catalog of Cuban women photographers. It is co-presented by Women Photographers International, an organization that I created in 2018 to promote research, support, and educate about the contributions of those who identified as women and non-binary subjects in photography. Having begun as a dynamic database showcasing the unique stories of women identified Cuban photographers, WOPHA has extended its geographic scope to include photographers around the globe. The organization is currently documenting the diverse artistic production of Latin American and Latinx communities, including photographers from Mexico, Central America, the Caribbean, and artists of Latin American descent living and working in the United States. The WOPHA Congress situates itself in a border space, as defined by Chicana feminist writer Gloria Anzaldúa. A third space where people, a border space, a third space, where people from multiple nationalities converge and language cross-pollinate and are revitalized. It established Miami as a meeting place for photography by embracing this border space and by producing a gathering defined by the social interactions of sisterhood and solidarity. We have produced a photo book. The name is Becoming Sisters, Women Photography Collectives and Organizations to commemorate this gathering. It is both a registry and collective manifesto of 4 international women and non-binary collectives that activate photography as a collaborative tool for connecting and creating community. It is available for purchase at PAMM Store and online at wophacongress.org. Your purchase grants a WOPHA membership and supports this year's WOPHA Congress and our future gatherings. Also, today is Give Miami Day, the biggest online campaign that encourages all to become philanthropists. Donations made to WOPHA through this initiative will enable us to continue nurturing the careers of women in photography, documenting and highlighting the plurality of women, trans, queer, and other non-binary voices in the discipline. It's with this spirit of sisterhood and solidarity that I present the conversations that will take place during the first session, and specifically the panel, Our History of Women Photographers. Few women photographers' names have been canonized. The renown of the great masters has airbrushed them out of the academic history of photography. The erasure of women from history stems from a long tradition of being discredited. However, this groundbreaking, independent photographers have endlessly documented, questioned, and transfigured the world, demonstrating that the camera can be a tool of individual and collective emancipation. Upon closer examination, it is evident that women participated in all the movement and artistic experiments of the 19th and 20th centuries. The next panel present for the first time the collective survey here, for the first time here in Miami in the United States, the collective survey, Our History of Women Photographers, nominated to the 2021 Historical Book Award by the Arles Festival. The book includes 450 images by 300 women photographers and contributions by 160 women authors, myself included. 160 women authors from around the world on the diversity and careers of these photographers. So please join me and welcome my colleague Ileana Selejan that we met 2 years ago at the Fast Forward Women in Photography Conference at the Tate Modern. I am super glad to be together in this opportunity this time. And well, Ileana will introduce the panel. She is a research fellow with the Decolonising Arts Institute and associate lecturer at the University of the Arts London. As honorary research fellow at University College London, she is part of the European Research Council funded project Citizens of Photography, the Camera and the Political Imagination. She was the Linda Wyatt Grover 66 Curatorial Fellow in Photography at the Davis Museum at Wellesley College, where she curated the exhibition Charlotte Brooke at Look 1951-1972. With a focus on photography in Latin America, her research investigates Nicaraguan citizens' engagement with politics through photography and how photographs are circulated across the public sphere. Our conversations are being recorded during the next 2 days and will be available on the WOPHA Congress website. So please subscribe to our newsletter at wopha.org and follow us on social media at WOPHA Foundation and WOPHA Congress to stay up to date about the news of the organization. Also, please add your questions in the chat. At the end of each panel, we will have some open time for discussions. So thank you so much for being here and for sharing this moment, and welcome, Ileana. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Aldeide, for the wonderful introduction. And of course, thank you for inviting me to be a part of this incredible, momentous event and to moderate this panel. It is a really great pleasure for me to be here with you today. I just want to start and to explain a little bit the format of the session. So I will introduce our first two speakers, Marie Robert and Luce Lebart, who will speak about this beautiful book that they have edited, Une histoire mondiale des femmes photographes, a world history of women photographers. After they've given their presentations, I will introduce our third speaker, artist Maria Kapajeva. And there will be a brief discussion amongst us, after which I will be opening the floor to questions from the audience. However, like Aldeide said, if you already have questions, just pop them into the Q&A box and we will address them at the end. Okay, so our first speaker, Marie Robert, is head curator of photography at the Musée d'Orsay in Paris. She has organized around 10 exhibitions of the collection, marked by the social sciences, and also co-curated, amongst other shows, Splendor and Misery, Pictures of Prostitution, Who's Afraid of Women Photographers, Jazz Power, and this fall in 2021, Enfin le cinéma. She taught from 2014 to 2017 the history of photography through the lens of gender at the École du Louvre. With Luce Lebart, in 2020, she co-edited Une histoire mondiale des femmes photographes at Éditions Textuelles. Her current research explores relationships between photography and other media. Okay, and our second speaker, Luce Lebart, is a French historian of photography, curator, and researcher for the Archive of Modern Conflict. Her research focuses on archives, images, and practices that have remained in the shadow of history. Since 2012, she has curated 20 international exhibitions. She has written numerous essays and is the author of 12 books, among them Inventions 1915 to 1938 from 2019, Gold and Silver from 2018, Les Grands Photographes du XXe siècle, Larousse, published by Larousse in 2017, Le Silence d'Alger from 2015, and with Marie Robert in 2020, she co-edited Une histoire mondiale des femmes photographes. So I leave the floor to you.
Thank you very much, Ileana, and thank you very, very much, Aldeide and Marie, for this invitation. I am very honored to participate to this huge moment and great event, and to begin with Luce and Maria, the symposium. First and foremost, I want just to express how I am profoundly grateful to all the specialists for their contribution to this book in Histoire mondiale des femmes photographes. It has been a worldwide feminist friendly adventure. So now please forgive me, I'm going to speak in French. Next, please.
Who knows today the tragic fate of the American reporter Dicky Chappelle, who died in Vietnam under the bombs in 1965? Who knows that we owe the rediscovery of Eugene Adje to Berenice Abbott's commitment? Who knows that the photo romance of Pushpamala have nothing to do to envy to Cindy Sherman's series of cross-dressing, and that the first book of photography published in 1843 was the work of the British Anna Atkins? Not many people, because the erasure of women in the history of photography is the result of a long tradition of denial and discredit. Next. The reason for this disqualification have multiple for 2 centuries. A few are reoccurring. Practitioners of an art considered minor in comparison with the noble arts such as painting or sculpture, they were often considered second-rate operators because they were women. Assigned primarily to the roles of muses or models, women were often described as assistants to the creative process as a mere executive of the retouching and coloring of photograph, laboratory work, the college of prints, and the constitution of albums, obtaining at best the status of assistants. Wives, daughters, or sisters of male photographers, many have also remained in the shadow of a master, at the risk of seeing their contribution fade from memory. And this is the case of Constance Talbot, who accompanied her husband, William Henry Fox, in the experimentation of the negative-positive process. She is also probably the first woman to produce photographic images. Yet, who remembers her? Amélie Guillot-Saguet exhibited her calotype in Paris in 1849. She was awarded a medal, but the jury's reporter confused her with her husband. As for the German artist Hila Becher, although her work is inseparable from that of her husband, her first name is not even mentioned in the articles relating their first joint exhibition in 1963. Educated to assist and encourage their spouses to keep their ambitions to themselves, women have often diminished their own investment in photography, presenting it as the involuntary result of an external event or the fruit of a happy accident. Imogen Cunningham says that her 3 young children do not allow her to photograph anything other than the flowers and plants she grows in her garden. Or in a testimony published in 1941, Lee Miller herself underestimates her artistic role with Man Ray, her companion, with whom she rediscovered the principle of solarization during a laboratory accident. It is also because they are socially confined to the private sphere that women have long specialized in certain photographic genres, reinforcing the idea of a feminine and therefore minor art, such as photocollage, still life, reproduction of arts, tableau vivant, or even genre scenes relating to the domestic universe, both in the 19th century England or after the post-revolutionary Iran War. Specialization in the portraiture of children and women, too, is a constant. In the early 20th century in London, Lally Shard assumed an explicit strategy as a women's photographer, emphasizing the skills of the women of her time: empathy, gentleness, attention to detail, or color. It is certain that in cultural areas where sexual segregation is a result of a religious ban, women studio photographers are sought after by the client of the same sex. Then Lydie Bonfils in Beirut at the end of the 19th century, or Nassi Souman in Constantinople in the 20s, reserved their shots for Muslim women. This specialization is certain genres considered minor is also the product of a regular exclusion from the structurally androcentric field of photography, particularly in Latin countries. Workshops, societies, or clubs, schools, agencies, those institutions have long closed their doors to women. Whether discrimination is explicitly written into the statutes or more insidiously the result of an operation based on entre-soi, sponsorship, or co-option. For example, in the beginning of the 20th century, the Buffalo Camera Club was forbidden to women. If the Canadian Clara Sipol was able to participate, it was through the intermediary and complicity of her photographer brother. The manufacturers themselves have contributed to the association of women with a depreciated form of photography, for example, by accompanying the marketing of their cameras with gender strategies. And then, in order to widen the market to a large public, the advertising arguments emphasized the alleged simplicity or use of their product. They're describing as being within the reach of women and of children. And then from the launch of its first handheld cameras in 1888, and for decades afterwards, the Kodak company relied on the figure of the Kodak girl, the embodiment of the amateur without technical knowledge. In 1932, an advertisement for Leica suggested that automatic focusing would enable women to stop blurring. Until the 1970s advertisement, which shows a woman holding the camera and saying, "It's really easy." The estimation is reinforced by the press, which discerns pseudo feminine specificity in the pictures of women. In a review of an exhibition held in Paris in 1937, a critic wrote this: "The brutal man points a lance like a machine gun. The woman, on the other hand, handles it tenderly after having caressed with her gaze the subject she intends to fix. A chasm separates the two gestures, femininity." Obviously, the sharing of territories between men and women causes concern and sometimes conflict. These potential rivals blur the boundaries by challenging the traditional division of sexual roles. As a result, they are regularly referred to their sexual identity and subjected to derogatory or even aggressive remarks. The Austrian photographer Alice Schalek, who covered the front during the First World War, showing the bloodshed and brutality of weapons, was called a battlefield hyena by the writer Karl Kraus. He was as much misogynist than he was anti-Semite. In 1928, a German Kuhl Portfolio Medal was unanimously acclaimed in avant-garde circles, with his photography of metal architecture, including the Eiffel Tower, which transformed into abstract composition, and it embodies the triumph of modernity. As a result, some nicknamed her the Iron Valkyrie. And then, in contrast, the Indian photojournalist Homai Variala has accepted to nickname Mummy from her colleagues. Desexualized and put on the pedestal of maturity, it is easier for her to involve in the male press. And yet, braving extreme climates and hostile environments, traveling to the farthest reaches of the planet, women explored the world very early on, often traveling alone, like men. Among many others, Ellen Messenger Murdoch, who undertook a round-the-world trip in 1913. Some are tested by imprisonment, whether in Russia, in the case of German Kohl in the early 20s, or in Brazil for Neir Benedicto in 1969, or they even die on the field, such as Gerda Taro. Others are enlisted by totalitarian regimes such as Beatrice Tudor, a spy in the service of the KGB, or resist fascist or Nazi oppression at the risk of their life. And many are also adventurers and heroines. The 500 page of the World of History of Women Photographers are everywhere and they recorded everything. They explored all facets of photographic practices, the category of fine art, and the multiple professional and media uses of photography, from portraiture to reportage, including advertising, science, fashion, travel, nudes, and even pornography. Artists or shopkeepers, professionals or amateurs, they have been as active in this public sphere as in the private one, penetrating all of the masculine bastions, such as the spectacle of sports, the public space, political sphere, the theater of war, but also the representation of the sexual body. The speed of this conquest, which of course varies from country to country, and it is linked to the pace of change in the social and political status, economic independence, possibility of working or moving free in the public arena, the right to vote or to study, and also the secularization of society, etc., etc. In fact, none of the 20th century upheaval escaped them, whether it was the two world wars, the liberation of the camps in 1945, or the tragedy of Hiroshima, the wars of independence, which sounded the era of decolonization, the social struggles of the 1960s and 70s, or the Iranian Revolution of 1979, Chernobyl disaster in 1886, or the collapse of the Soviet bloc, or the end of the apartheid in South Africa in the early 1990s. The device is a weapon, a means of resistance against oppression, be it patriarchal, colonial, or political. Systematically dominated and subaltern, they often choose to focus their lens on the excluded. They're looking at the women that are violated, the children that are exploited. They look at the workers, the exploited children, detainees, indigenous people, homosexual, transsexual, all the marginalized and the invisible, those obscure people of society who struggle and do not set the rules of the game. It is this empathy that makes Donna Ferrato a tireless activist in the fight against domestic violence, and what makes Claudia Andujeur an advocate for the Yanomami cause. As artists, the women experimented, often as pioneers, microphotography, solarization, photograms, luminous drawing, overprint, photomontage, photocollage, or even color processes. From the early performances of the Countess of Castiglione in the 19th century through the photographic diaries of the Lithuanian Veronika Slaivety, the artistic hoaxes of Ingi Moras, the photo poems of the Icelandic Valdis Oskar de Tour, or the artificial negatives of the Czech Bela Kalorova, each of those women formulates original proposals that explore the aesthetic powers of photography. The women also forget the stylistic and theoretical repertoire of modernity after having fed that of pictorialism. Their work participated fully in the avant-garde movement in the interwar period, surrealism, new objectivity, straight photography, but also all the movement of the second half of the 20th century, humanist photography, new subjectivity, plastic photography, etc., etc. They also gave birth to what would be called later the feminist avant-garde. In the 60s and the 70s, new generation of artists, such as Marianne Wex, such as Joe Spence and Nugel, All these women made their own bodies the main territory of a feminist and or an anti-colonial quest. So with photography is the privileged instrument within a diversity of media, such as video, writing, sculpture, and it is very performative practices. These women claim new representation of the female body, and they have staged erotic fantasies, document aging bodies, sick bodies, and those that medicine mistreats, such as Abigail Heyman facing her own abortion. Finally, it should be noted that in order to gain expertise, autonomy, and recognition, women committing themselves very early on to supporting vocation and also form networks of sociability among women and work to share their experience. Let us recall the first empowerment actions of this American photographer who encouraged the photography career of women through conferences or articles that appeared in the press at the end of the 19th century. For example, Elizabeth Whittington, Catherine Whitbarnes, or Francis Benjamin Johnston, who published in 1897 What a Woman Can Do with a Camera. Photography can definitely be at the service of women's emancipation. Another example, unable to join the Boys Club of the National Geographic Society, Harriet Chalmers Adams founded in Washington the Society of Women Geographers. In Spain, after the Second World War, Rosa Sux became involved in the self-management of the Groupe Femini, which encouraged the teaching and practice of artistic photography within women's group. Many have also a transmission activity. Dora Kalmus, Anne-Marie Henrich, Lisette Model, Jo Spence welcome apprentices in their studio, and then Helmut Newton trained with Eva from Berlin, Bill Brandt with Trude Fachmann from Vienna. Some studios were reserved for women, such as Florence Henry's in Paris in the 1930s. Other created training institute from Jadwiga Golst, who in 1906 participated in the creation of the future Kirchner School of Warsaw, or F. Keeler, who launched a conceptual school in Estonia, the Faculty of Test. Among all those who teach, we note about in New York from 1935, Lucia Moholy at the same time in London, Clara Langer in Budapest, Katie Horner in Mexico, but also Cristina Garcia Rodero in Madrid, Birgit Jurgensen in Vienna, and Tuzia Lindström in Gothenburg, and Nan Goldin at Yale and Harvard. Obviously, many women have published and sometimes interpreted their own images, like Toyoko Tokiwa here, who wears a rangefinder camera on her eye. But less known, women in photography have also been theorists and historians of photography. Through correspondence and diaries, autobiographies, manuals, manifestos, journal histories, university theses, works of photography applied to science or advertising, for many, thinking about the technical, aesthetic, or ontological capacity also means considering the social and therefore gendered dimension of its uses. In the 1930s was a period of intense ontological reflection, which found a powerful extension in the theoretical and political ferment of the 1970s. Hannah Wilke, Martha Rosler, Val Wilmer, Joe Spence, Jean Mutusami Ash, and Deborah Willis, and Pia Ark more recently, all subjecting photography to the question linking issues of gender, class, and race in their reflection. All these publications show that if it was still necessary, how much women have occupied the territory of historiography and have also been able to invest the field of the symbolic. In so doing, they have definitely gained access to the public sphere and to visibility.
Thank you. Thank you, Marie, for this enlightening introduction. And thank you, Aldeide, and all of you for this invitation to talk about this book we co-directed, Marie and I. This comprehensive book spotlights 300 women photographers since the beginning of photography and involves 160 authors, women authors from across the world. It was published by Éditions Textuelles, a French publisher, in November 2020 during the lockdown. So today is a kind of anniversary of this book that is 1 year old. And the good news is that it's going to be translated, is in its way to be translated in English by editor Thames and Hudson. So 10 minutes is a very short time to narrate the story of this book. It's been an incredible adventure, collaborative adventure, international adventure that has made us travel in time, friendship, space, and cross several continents and countries, all that virtually. This book has been very organic in the way it has been constructed through informal and formal construction of networks of many specialists and passionate people from all around the world. Marie and I would like to say that we have been intermediaries. So I will be presenting the book as a whole. Maybe next, yes. I will be presenting the book as a whole, as well as its vision. Then I'll tell about how the idea came about and in what context. And that will allow me to to talk about our editorial choices, some of the pitfalls and difficulties, and how we overcame them. The book has a strong bias. It is a book on women photographers, written by women. And it is also a book that seeks to put forward a decentered vision of the history of photography and its writing. Anybody who has had this book in hand knows that it is really heavy. And this is something Marie and I wanted. We wanted it to be heavier and bigger than most of French histories of photography made mainly by men, and in which women have long been overlooked. The book starts with an introduction to the project and its methodology, and is followed by a text enlightening the mechanism of invisibilization, on which Marie has presented a little bit. Then the book opens with the presentation of next Anna Atkins, English photographer and botanist, born in 1799, which means in 18th century. And more than 500 pages later, the book ends up with Iranian photographer Nesha Tavakulian, who was born in 1981. The period covered by the book is wide, from the dawn of photography to the end of 20th century. It was very important for us to include 19th century photographers, as we really wanted to share the idea that women photographers have worked from the origin of the medium and in different parts of the world, not only in Europe or in the US. Next. In this project, the question of geographical representativeness was just as important as that of historical representativeness. Our priority in the choices has always been to make room for women photographers from countries and continents less represented in Western history. It was so exciting to include women photographers from countries such as China. Here you see Hu Bo from Ghana, Felicia Ancha Aban. Next, from Groenland with Pierre Arke.
Oh, I should be here now.
Yeah, it's good. Argentina with Sarah Facio. Next, Turkey and South Africa with Yildiz Moran. and Leslie Lawson. Next. Brazil with Claudia Andujar, or Nigeria with Marilyn Nance. Next. Vision of the book. To sum it up, most important thing is that this book is a polyphonic, collaborative, and decentralized book. I will talk about those different points now. So next. So how to organize the book? We didn't want to gather the photographers following a geographical approach. It was complicated. You just saw Claudia Andujar. Claudia Andujar was born in Switzerland. Julia Margaret Cameron was born in India. What does geographical criteria means? It is complicated. And we didn't want either to organize the book following thematic approaches and under umbrella terms such as avant-garde. These are European and American-centric understandings. We wanted the reader to be able to focus on each woman, her work, her life individually. We chose a chronological approach. We both are historians. And we sort them out from their date of birth. I agree, it is very arbitrary, as it is to limit the book to 300 photographers. We could have had 1,000. This adventure was exciting, but of course frustrating. But the arbitrary of the date of birth was in a way neutral, so it convinced us all. Next. Sometimes we've had long discussion about the illustrations and of the book. We've been helped by the authors, and we've been helped by the photographers who could help to advise us to choose such or such images. Next. Sometimes some images cannot bear to be shown without explanation and context. This often happens. This is particularly the case of this image by Alice Seeley Harris. Explanations are needed. The authors were here, all those specialists to help us with that. And it was important for us because we wanted the book to reach a very wide audience. We didn't want only to reach the photo community. We had to find a balance. So now, next. How did this project started? It started from a very simple observation. Women are absent from the histories of photography. This is particularly true in France. We're very late, but it's also true in many other countries, such as Spain or even in the US. In France, the first Histoire de la photographie by Raymond Lecuyer, published in 1945, only mentions two women, Julia Margaret Cameron and Laure Albin Guillot. In the following histories of photography and until today, women are poorly represented. Only 70 female names out of a total of nearly 1,000 in the first one you see on the left, published in 1981. The one after, in 1994, focuses on 15 photographers, but no focus is on any woman photographer. And in the most recent one, on the right, only 46 images are produced by women. So it means 8% of the 600 illustrations. So numbers are not everything, but of course there are indicators. Next. In Spain, the situation is summed up here with those examples that were, this slide was given to me as the next one by Aldeide Delgado, who is one of our Spanish Catalan authors. So very few women. Next. And in the US, the numbers are also kind of worrying until quite late. One thing is sure, for a long time, history has been written by men and intended for men. Even when they have achieved real recognition from their peers during their lifetime, women tend to disappear from the great creation story. This phenomenon concerns many fields of science, politics, art, its revision concerns all those fields. I recently attended to a conference by a French historian of art who reminded us that in 2013, prehistorians realized that most of the prehistoric paintings in caves had probably been made by women. It was published last year in France in a book titled The Prehistoric Man is Also a Woman, revisioning the way prehistory was written mainly by men and forgetting about women. Next. The problem is also semantic, as Rosiska Parker and Griselda Pollock demonstrated in their book All Mistresses, Women, Art and Ideology, published in 1981. They asked themselves, I quote them, how was it possible by the later 20th century to have erased women as artists from art history so comprehensively that the idea of the artist was exclusively masculine? Why was this erasure more radical in the 20th century than before? Why is everything that compromises greatness in art coded as feminine? Next. The work of so many women has been overshadowed or even forgotten. Before knowing those numbers, this struck me in practice while I was working on two books, one book in 2016, one book on great masters of photography of 20th century. So at the same time, I was preparing an anthology of texts of Eugene Adjé and exploring the question of canons and the making of canons through notably Abigail Solomon writings. So for this Larousse book, I tried to include as many women as men, but it was so complicated. The fame of male photographers superseded that of the female ones. So considering the difficulty of balancing women and men photographers, I realized that the practical solution could be, one of the solutions could be to create a book devoted exclusively to female photographers, a book written by women from all over the world. This would be a way to escape the andro-centered and the Euro-centered vision. Textual Edition in 2016 was very into this project and supported it. His director is a feminist and committed woman who strived to find funding. That was a very important part of the project. And then I approached Marie Robert. We knew each other from a board, the board of the French Society of Photography. And Marie had recently organized this wonderful exhibition dedicated to female photographers at Musée d'Orsay with Thomas Galifou and Ulrich Pollmann called Who is Afraid of Women Photographers? Marie loved the concept. She wanted to carry on this research and was also attracted by the idea of not focusing on European and American women photographers. Together with Textuel and with the support from Rencontre d'Arles and Kering, we elaborated this book. Next. Oh, sorry. This is the advertisement of the Who is Afraid of Women Photographers show. Next. This is to remind that one of the first moments in France when women artists became a real subject of research and exhibition was related to this show called Elle at Centre Georges Pompidou, a bit more than 10 years ago. Next. In thinking of this book, we asked ourselves a couple of questions. How do we proceed in reflecting the diversity of practices and uses in photography? How do we avoid the pitfall of a Western-centered approach? When we developed the project from France, we both are French, with concepts and methods inherited from European cultural history. How can we not overprivilege cultural areas in which critical research is advanced? How can we create space for those who are forgotten without avoiding those who are more known? Where do we find the balance? So once again, I repeat it, but our priority has always been the same, to leave as much room as possible for proposition from other continents. We had to limit the quantity of European or American artists whose works are now more accessible. And to reach a geographical balance, we used pies, camembert in French, and numbers, and controlled the occurrences of photographers. Next. This is an extract of the list of 300 photographers. Next. This is an extract of the list of authors. So how did we identify those photographers? To identify them and build the list, we cross-investigated with our network of fellow curators, independent curators, university researchers, photographers, artists, women journalists, all women who had already worked on biography of women photographers or who were in contact with photographers and researchers. Our research really relies on a network of international experts. These experts put their knowledge and passion at the service of the project. Platforms, associations, and collectives dedicated to the history or promotion of women photographers have also consolidated this network, among them Fast Forward and WOPHA. So we wanted to promote women writers as well as women photographers. This is also a very important point. In making this book, we wanted both to promote women photographers and women authors, women in the research community today. You see some examples here. This is why we have decided to use only female feathers. We know they are often less prominent than males. Also, it appears that it's mostly women who have researched extensively on female photographers. Through this research, there is also a process of collective empowerment. Aldeide, you talked about sisterhood. It is important for women to create solidarity, to show that women also produce amazing research and knowledge. In choosing the authors, we also had in head to reflect the diversity of ways of writing history. We included, as I already said it, but artists, picture editor, journalists, not only academics or institutional. Next, most of them working with different methodology. For example, here, Aldeide Delgado, she works from archives in order to find 19th century studio photographer in Barcelona. So it's very, very precise, accurate as a research. And she was a press photographer. Next. Of course, many photographers are missing in this book. And since the publication, we don't stop we carry on receiving messages, exciting messages, such as this one by Erika Lederman, who works at the V&A in London. So Erika devotes herself to research about institutional women photographers in museums and institutions in 19th century. And we couldn't include all those photographers. I mean, there is room for so many books and research. Next. So this is a photo by one of these institutional photographers that is not in this book, as many others. Next. Oh, I chose to end with this slide because, not really, and there is another one, with this slide, because this photographer, Donna Ferrato, that Marie mentioned, was not in our 300 list. When we were close to finish the book, we had 300 photographers. And in the end, she's in the book. And it was a really nice encounter with Melissa Harris, who convinced us. She talked so well about this photographer that I didn't know. It was a real discovery, and that we so committed to the fake of to stop violence toward women, etc., that we decided in the end to include it. This is just a little secret. This book includes a bit more than 300 photographers. It's just to say it was so difficult to stop. Next. Okay, this is the last one. So to sum it up, this is an extract of the final words of our introduction. We have not aimed at deconstructing existing histories, but to completing them, to write others in the canon for a richer, fairer story. In short, we both felt that there is an urgent need to write another story differently. Our book is political. It assumes pluriculturality and affirms the social and constructed dimension of identities, whether sexual or racial. Our project considers essential to offer role models and references. This book aims at being a prerequisite for an alternative world history of photography through the prism of gender and cultural decentralization. And we both hope that it will have sense in this movement that gives back visibility to the invisible. We hope that it will help make the history of photography also that of everyone. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Luce. Wonderful presentation, and Marie also. And for the audience, just please start thinking of questions that you want to ask and pop them in the Q&A. I can see the very active chat. Thank you very much for all of your comments and greetings. I would like now to introduce our third and last speaker for this session, Maria Kapajeva, who is an artist who works between Estonia and London. Her work often highlights peripheral histories and unspoken stories, focusing on the representation of women. This year, her book, Dream is Wonderful Yet Unclear, won the Krasna Kraus Foundation Award, and in 2018, her first book, You Can Call Him Another Man, was shortlisted for the Aperture Photo Book Award. Her work has been exhibited internationally, and she is an awardee of the Gasworks and Triangle Network Fellowship and the Women's Work Award with the Creative Europe program. Alongside her artistic practice, Maria works as project manager for the research project Fast Forward Women in Photography, which is based at the University for the Creative Arts in the UK. This year, she has started a practice-based PhD at the Estonian Academy of Arts. So please, Maria.
Thank you so much, Ileana. I hope everyone can hear me. So just wave me if something wrong. And of course, first of all, I would like to thank Aldeide and all her team of Women Photographers International Archive for organizing such an incredible event and inviting me to be part of it. I'm really honored. And it's a special pleasure to be actually with Marie and Luce on the same panel, because we had quite long conversations via emails about their book. So it's so great to be at least somehow with them together through the Zoom. And I also would like to thank them to trust in me being one of these contributors. And I think their book is a really great sample of kind of how networking works. And this is what I probably would like a bit to focus and extend of on the ways of how Fast Forward work. And I think that's also how Aldeide and Ileana, you both met up through the conference which we organized. So it's always great to see how networking is extending and successfully working for everyone's. And so can you put the slide, please? Yeah, I'll try to say kind of quickly that. So yeah, just as a kind of a mention, just to see how I ended up on this panel and through this book, even my contribution was quite small in the one article, but was very important for me and I believe for Estonia. And also I was happy to consult Marie and Luce on the kind of Baltic states region and Russia. So I was being able to introduce them to other excellent professionals who could write and propose some other names from this region. And for me, what was very important, and I was very grateful that they could include at least one name from my country, Estonia, and it's Eve Keeler, who is also very great sample of incredible professional who, and especially in the early 90s, when Estonia regained the independence, and a kind of how she contributed to the photography world, especially the photography education, which did not really exist in Estonia as a separate, and also bring kind of a recognition photography as a medium, as one of the art forms. And for me, it was also very important to highlight her, because quite often that stories of photography education is coming in Estonia with a male name, and her living kind of in a bit of shadow, even though they collaborated equally together of that. So I was really happy that her name is now in some ways in this wonderful book. Next. And I don't have a time actually to talk so much about my practice, but I do often kind of works with the questions around representation and visibility of women, and kind of the issues which might stay kind of invisible in the mainstream narrative. So this is just kind of a slide, a glimpse of what I do. This is still from one of my most recent video work, which looks at the invisibility of women after 40. So, and I will not be talking about that. I thought I would rather use this opportunity to talk about the very close to my heart, the research projects I'm involved, Fast Forward Women in Photography, where I work as a project manager. Next. And the project was initiated and started by incredible women, Anna Fox and Karen Noor, who is also very recognized and established photographers from the UK. So I stepped in quite at the very beginning as a researcher, and then still working for that. Next slide, thank you. So the project basically aims to promote engaged with women in photography, to build up and extend an international network. And I think that's our key point in everything what we do, to support and initiate research on the women in photography, and also to educate and support women in the field. And how we do those things, it's in a way, we have the website, which you can see now. It's pretty much just the stills from the website, and we tend to organize the different kind of events, conferences, mentorship, educational programs, and that's how it's opportunity for professionals to meet up, to talk about the research on the women photography, and exactly to do what also Marie Vickles did with their book, is actually bringing up and recognize more forgotten names, or less recognized names, or who stay behind in the histories and in the present. So, and you can see in this, and the next slide, you can see some kind of the projects which we have already done, and they were 3 conferences so far. We organized 2 of them were at Tate Modern in 2015 and 2019. One conference was organized at Lithuanian National Gallery of Arts, and now we are excited to work on a conference in Georgia and Tbilisi. So we really hope, it's been postponed for 2 years already, but we're really like holding our breath that next year it's going to happen, and we're very excited about it. And conferences is exactly an opportunity to bring research from all over the world. And we always organize it through the open calls, try to see not just only what we already know, who works in the field, but actually through the open calls, we get a lot of surprises and interesting, exciting research and names which coming towards us, which is always great. Next slide. And just kind of briefly say what else we do. For example, this is very exciting project, which is mostly in the UK though based, but it's a focusing actually on the various groups of refugees in the different parts of the UK. And we have, as you see on the slide, the partner organizations we work with. It's Autograph and Women for Refugee Women in London, Impressions Gallery in Bradford, and National Galleries of Scotland in Edinburgh, and Workshop Grow as an online platform. So we also very excited that this is a quite short for us project and 1 year long, but what we're trying to do is create a new publication, a series of podcasts, and a series of short films as a result of it. But of course, these are outcomes for wider public to spread the word. But what is the key for us is actually to introduce the women with the photographic skills and gain them confidence, let their stories to be told, and let them to speak up and give them voices. So that's the a main kind of purpose. Next slide. And what I would like kind of to share using this opportunity, that actually all our conferences, for example, are video recorded, and all the videos, presentations of papers, unless the speakers ask not to, they're all shared on our website, and you are more than welcome to watch them and refer to them in the future. So please do so. Next slide. And also very briefly to say what else we're trying to do in terms of the international audience on through our channels is having on our website a section as a journal. We're basically referencing a lot of articles, texts, conversations, events, platforms, you name it, which becomes to be growing database of whatever happens with women in photography, they do, or some initiatives and support is available, or some critical discussions around that. So it's also, I would recommend it as a good resource to read, to look, and find some new organizations and names. Next. And what we try to do, of course, is kind of try to support and promote women in the photographic world. So we kind of using and promoting different opportunities. And recently, our team made decision not to promote any cause which required any fees to be paid, because we kind of find them not so being equal for everyone's to be contributed or to submit their work. Next slide. And then we have an incredible online gallery on our website. I really recommend to look artists who are there also from all over the world. So we curated together with Anna Fox. And next slide. And what we recently started for a couple of years is also finding a bit of that frustration, which Marie was sharing when they were working on the book. Their book is also something quite often. These photo books of the years from different professionals and organizations, they come still we see somehow tendency that more men come to this list than women. So we decided to every year ask very different professionals to suggest some books from their regions to look at and recommend. So we called it like photo book of the year and next. So it's a kind of also opportunity to introduce to bigger audience some books and authors which might not be visible. And a great sample you see on the slide now, Indo Anthony, who recently with this book, I mean, not because of us, of course, but because of her book is great. She was shortlisted for the Aperture for the Book Award at Paris Forum. Next. And I would like to mention, this is what I actually lead and curate Instagram, our Instagram, which became very popular. And I really recommend everyone's curators and researchers who somehow interested more, extend their list of professionals exist in the world. So every week there is a new person, really globally. I'm really working hard on that, trying to represent all possible regions and countries through this, giving them opportunity for 1 week to celebrate and present their works. Next. And then in the end, yeah, next slide. And in the end, I really felt important to mention that a year ago, we decided to form a manifest as a sort of a need to speak up and form kind of a text which could be used further to really make big changes, not just kind of on the words, but in the actions and maybe even in the legal sense. So next slide. So this manifest is available on our website. And this is kind of really to highlight that the women photographers play a vital role in our community, and yet their stories are frequently hidden, lost, or dismissed. And as photography known as a democratic medium and involvement with and enjoyment from photographic arts is a fundamental human right. Lives are enriched by experiencing photography, bringing democracy and equality to society when everyone has right to take part. So that women artists and photographers contribute to the emancipation to all members of the diverse community, despite their gender, sexuality, or striving for equality in a democratic society. And we formed this manifesto from 8 key points, which you can see on the website, but you can also read them on our website. And I really encourage everyone who believes in what it says in it to join us in it and sign it up. And there is an opportunity to sign it as an individual as well as organization. So we hope that we can use that as to bring a change and recognize the women contribution to the photography. Thank you.
Wonderful, Maria. Thank you very much. I have to say that is the perfect tone, I feel, to end this session with this kind of mobilizing call to sign the manifesto. And also, I want to, of course, I want to thank all 3 of the speakers for their wonderful presentations, so rich. And also, yeah, I will absolutely, agree with all 3 of you that there is a political claim at stake. And I think that we're all very, very much involved in that. So I just really want to acknowledge the incredible amount of effort that has gone on behalf of you working on these specific projects. And of course, all the other hundreds and thousands of women and who have made this work, this effort historically, too many of whom are yet to be acknowledged, but we're getting there, right? So I want to ask now for our viewers to, we already have a few questions in the Q&A box, so please keep adding your questions. And I want to invite Luce and Marie to please join me on the screen. If you could switch your camera on. Thank you very much. And I will just start off with one question, which is for Marie and for Luce. In your introduction to the book, you speak about something that you call a historiographic void, un vide. And I really loved that in terms of that the volume seeks to address. And you also mention a need for a willingness to know. In French, you say la volonté de savoir, versus a historical unwillingness to know of the work of women practitioners. So my question to the two of you is there a willingness now? What has changed? What happened?
Luce, tu veux aller? Évidemment qu'aujourd'hui, je crois qu'il y a une volonté collective pour savoir ce que les femmes ont fait à l'histoire de la photographie. Et notre livre, il s'inscrit très modestement dans ce mouvement très général. Je pense que c'est une petite pierre parmi d'autres. Et ce que l'on montre dans l'introduction et que Luce a effleuré, mais le temps nous manque, c'est que précisément, nous ne sommes pas les premières, évidemment encore moins les dernières dans cette volonté de savoir l'histoire, la contribution des femmes dans cette histoire. Et l'une des spectateurs du panel a mentionné Naomi Rosenblum. Bien évidemment, nous l'évoquons dans notre introduction, toutes les femmes et les hommes aussi qui ont commencé à explorer, à faire une archéologie en fait, explorer l'histoire des femmes dans la photographie. Mais il est clair que depuis quelques années, il y a un renforcement de ce désir de la part des réseaux de militantes, qu'elles soient chercheuses ou engagées politiquement, en France et à l'étranger.
Merci, Marie. I'm being told that the interpreter is no longer around, so I'm going to try to briefly summarize what Marie just said. Sorry about that. So Marie was saying that, now there is this very concerted effort. I like that she called militant, like it's a militant effort, because I think indeed it is. And that is being consolidated, and it comes on behalf of researchers, but not only, of course. And also she said that someone in the public, and I think it was Angela Kelly, who is also a wonderful photographer, she mentioned that Naomi Rosenblum's book hasn't been brought up yet, and Marie was saying that the book is mentioned in the introduction, and they've tried to be as comprehensive as possible in acknowledging how all of those sources kind of came together. I'm also told that we have a very, very little bit of time left for the conversation. So I'm going to just read out just a few questions, and then you can jump at them as you wish. So somebody is asking about Abigail Heyman's work, and specifically about how she photographed her own abortion, the picture that Marie showed. How was the photograph received is the question. Then this is from Elisa Turner, who's also saying, thank you very much for everything. And then Mette Sandby is saying, thank you for your important work, a book, Marie and Luce. According to my own research in women photographers in Denmark and the rest of Scandinavia and England, around 40%, maybe even more, of the registered professional photographers were women in 1901, according to the census. What is your impression on France and maybe other parts of the world? Were there as many? Interesting question about the turn of century. Also, I see a question from Judy Kay, who is saying, maybe it's an unpopular stance, but the quota systems do not ensure quality. And she's saying she would prefer a blind selection of art with artist name and gender unknown than a quota system. So this is a conversation, of course, about how your criteria for selection, how you went about kind of selecting the photographers in the book. There is also a question from Alison Bola, who says, respectfully, Judy, I think she's responding to Judy, and she's saying blind selection of art typically happens to aesthetic norms that belong to the dominant community. Artists from marginalized communities often work within their community's norm. How then could you propose blind selection accounts for that? Very, very good response. So yes, so I invite you to respond to any of these three questions, whoever would like to start.
Just a word about Abigail Eman. In fact, it's Clara Bouvres in the book. She's an art historian, photography historian, and she wrote the text on Abigail Eman. And we must also say that she wrote 3 books for Photopoche, and it's also a very important publication about women photographers. And Clara shows in her text that Abigail Eman, she was a freelance photojournalist, and in 1974 she published a very strange book, a photojournal, very intimate book, showing the life of women in the States. And this image is so strong with medicine dominating the situation, and with a woman with her legs open. It was a very feminist and strong engagement by Abigail Eman to show how the personal is politic, in fact.
Mm-hmm. Does anyone want to take the question about the quotas system, the camembert, or about the question about percentage of female photographers registered around the turn of the century? And we had the example of Scandinavia and England, about 40%, very large number.
So I continue, but Luce and Maria, please speak. But somebody wrote also for us. Thank you very much, Met, for your question. Met wrote in particular about Julie Lorberg, a very interesting pioneer photographer, and she showed, in fact, that there were some very important differences between the cultural areas. And of course, there were a lot of women photographers in the 19th century in France, but they were very specialized in the studio photography, for instance, or reproduction of works of art. There were a lot of amateur photographers, women photographers, but we lost all their archives, and we have a big work to do to explore and to refine them. But as I try to explain, a lot of them were working with their husbands, and they were totally forgotten. For instance, Geneviève Disdery, she was the wife of Eugène Disdery, but when she died, it was written that she had no profession. She completely disappeared of the histories. But the main difference is that in France, I think that women were considered as minor persons because of the Code Civil Napoleonian. And there is big difference with the States or the North European countries. It's true.
I would love to add something, considering your first question about the moment and the void, etc. Just wanted to say that when we started the project and started writing to many of you, we were amazed by the amazing will to collaborate, to participate, the generosity of, and it was in many countries everywhere, and we were very and I think that maybe also internet, social networks, also those way of communicating makes those networks easier, and it's great.
Thank you. I wanted to add also, I think that the very definitions of what is understood, by photography have shifted fundamentally. And from my own research in women photographers in the 1960s and in the Cold War era, I can tell very clearly that many women photographers were excluded because they worked as journalists or for different magazines, and they were just simply not seen as artists. And this has to do with kind of the ongoing prestige of the art photographer, with kind of neglecting an enormous amount of work that was done, oftentimes in very kind of commercial settings. Or let's not even start talking about studio photography, which is a widely disseminated practice around the world and which is completely neglected still in the history of photography, right? Okay, I also okay. I'm very sorry, but I'm told that we have to wrap up. So if there's anything that Maria or Marie or Luce would like to add, yes, Maria, please.
I just would like to mention that only one new publication came out while we're preparing this panel we're talking about, which is very exciting book. I'm happy to be part of, being included in this book. But it's by Emma Luce, assistant curator at Tate Modern, and it calls Photography: A Feminist History, which is also very exciting, and I really recommend everyone to check that. It's just come out, and please do check. There are exciting names in it.
Wonderful, thank you. Okay, everyone, update your bibliographies now and start reading. So thank you very, very much to the speakers and to the questions and to the audience for this engaged participation. Very much appreciate everyone's presence here. And we're going to now move on to the next panel. I don't know if any one of the organizers wants to say anything in terms of if there is a break or not. I'm not quite sure. But thank you very much, and I say goodbye here.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you, Ileana, and to all of the wonderful panelists for this session. As you were told at the outset that we were going to have time for videos in the in-between, we're not. We're a little bit crunched on time as it's already 11:34. So we're going to move forward with the next session, the conversation, Can Men Create Feminist Photography, between Charlotte Jansen and Atej Sildak. So let me just say hello and welcome. I am Heather Dyack, an art historian, critic, and curator based in Miami. And I want to acknowledge first that I am speaking to you from the unceded territories of the Seminole and Miccosukee people. I'm grateful to Aldeide Delgado for the invitation to introduce this session and to be a part of this Congress, hosted by WOPHA and the Pérez Art Museum in Miami. To all of you in the audience, please feel free to post questions at any time by typing into the Q&A function in the lower right-hand side of your screen. And we've reserved space at the end of this session, ideally, to address these. Okay, next slide, please. Conversation today between Charlotte Jansen and Atej Sildak hinges on a question that is deliberately provocative, if not problematic, in part by its very asking. Can men create feminist photography? There is so much to unpack here. Beginning with the noun men, the very notion of creation, the concept of feminism. By some accounts, these words are defined foremost by the personal. But I would argue that particularly where feminism is concerned, the personal, the individual, is never the only stake involved. Each of these terms comes together here in a question that is additionally underpinned by a truly elusive medium, namely photography, a mode of image making that is unpredictable in part because of its frequent claims to true representation or objective reality. As the broader WOPHA Congress seeks to discuss and debate, photography and gender have a long and troubling history. What pathways can be envisioned for their future? Woman as a subject for the camera is an old story. Female subjectivity, on the other hand, is a battle continuously being waged. And though I would posit that bodily concerns are frequently central to this dynamic, they do not define the limits of feminist inquiry. In what ways can photography push feminism beyond acts of essentializing, beyond normative binaries, and towards intersectionality? I show here the work of Sarah Swinar because it is a prime example of a female identifying artist's self-reflexive take on the fundamental role of images in the assemblage of gender, particularly regarding capitalist consumption. With Tracy Pantyhose of 2017, through layers of screens, appended images, and found objects, varying degrees of opacity and transparency, an Asian American woman poses. As with other works by Swinar, tropes of femininity, societal demands,
the desire to be so-called picture perfect within the constraints of visual culture surface. The photograph here is a statement about the messy interrelations between identity, artifice, and perception, the construction of self and other via images. Next. Next slide, thank you. I show you here two photographic works that use strategies of overlaid text to address and challenge the inscription of gender roles as written on the body. On the left, Barbara Kruger's Continuously Relevant, Your Body is a Battleground poster from 1989. And on the right, Shirin Neshat's Rebellious Silence, 1994, the artist's self-portrait bisected by the barrel of a rifle. Each of these are studies in contrast that challenge conservative notions of biological determinism. Each point to ways in which objectification and societal expectation invariably raise questions of violence and self-possession. Construction. These images remain prescient at a time when elected leaders, and this is just one example, elected leaders in the United States are attempting to legislate away the rights of women, trans people, and other LGBTQ people with furious speed. Over 500 abortion restrictions have been introduced in 44 states this year alone, along with record-shattering numbers of anti-LGBTQ measures enacted into law. How women are represented in pictures is not simply about acts of looking, acts of picturing, or acts of being seen, but also potentially acts of oppression with very real life consequences. Next slide. I turn now to Lorna Simpson, who likewise uses the nouns he and she deftly, who in showing a Black woman in a crisp white shift dress seen only from behind, pouring water from vessels as though she were the embodiment of judicial scales, poses the question, who is in the judgment seat and who is to bear the weight of that judgment? After all, what can a photograph ultimately reveal about gender, especially when one's account of the way things are is repeatedly discredited? As with other forms of photography, images understood as conveying anything specific or fixed about either gender or political identity often say more about the preconceptions of the viewer. Next slide. Consider Dana Claxon's Defiance 2, an image that on the one hand conveys signs of femininity. For example, the bling of the long, colorful false nails. But this too is enigmatic, ambiguously anchored by an unseen body, calling to mind the ways cosmetics can also signal the fluidity, the openness of gender and gendered possibilities that refuse to be nailed down. The four painted colors symbolize the four directions in Lakota culture. Red for north and the cold hardships that must be endured. Yellow for east, the direction from which the sun comes, standing for new beginnings, light and wisdom. Black for the west, from where the sun sets, and white for south, standing for warmth and growth. This photograph could be seen as a veritable compass of intersectional power, reminding us, as Marie Anna James Guerrero has poignantly argued, and I'm quoting here, any feminism that does not address land rights, sovereignty, and the state's systemic erasure of the cultural practice of Native peoples is limited in vision and exclusionary in practice. Adjacent to the right, Tina Modati's photograph Hands Resting on Tool of 1926 shows a detailed close-up of an anonymous laborer's worn and dusty hands atop a tool, simultaneously conceding to work while issuing a silent refusal. I include it as a nod to labor and solidarity and the many subtle photographic forms an oppositional fist can take. Next slide. I will end with one final work, selected from the documentary photographs of LaToya Ruby Fraser and her series, The Last Cruise, which chronicles the closing of the General Motors plant in Lordstown, Ohio in 2019, and allows an intimate view of the impact of on the lives of its workers. The circle of United Auto Workers, beheld at a distance from above, faces us as viewers with placards in hand, fighting for a better future. To my mind, Fraser's practice is distinctly feminist in the way it engages with social realities and lived subjectivity. Hers is a feminism dedicated to rectifying political injustices that are not limited exclusively to or by questions of gender, and which asks, what role does photography play in the service of patriarchy and capitalism? And moreover, how can these entwined structures be dismantled? So it's in this spirit that I will turn the floor over now to Charlotte and Atesh, who I would like to formally introduce. Charlotte Jansen is a British Sri Lankan writer based in London. Jansen has written extensively on contemporary art for The Guardian, The Financial Times, British Vogue, Frieze, the British Journal of Photography, and Artsy, among others. She is the former commissioning editor of Elephant magazine. Jansen is the author of 2 books on contemporary photography, examining the social and political function of the gaze. And the titles of these are Girl on Girl, Art and Photography in the Age of the Female Gaze, and Photography Now, which is recently released by Tate. She's also the presenter of the Dior Talks podcast series, The Female Gaze, exploring the relationship between feminism, fashion, and photography. Atesh Sildak lives and works in Palm Beach County. His parents are both from Turkey. He received a BA in English Literature from the University of Central Florida and is an alum of Dreyfus School of Arts. Using short films, music videos, and photography, the Sildak aims to create a safe space and medium in which marginalized communities can exuberantly express themselves. He is a recipient of a 2019 South Florida Cultural Consortium, 3rd place in the South Florida Cultural Council's Biennial of 2021, and is currently working on an art in public places documentary for the city of West Palm Beach. Sildak's works have appeared at the NSU Art Museum Fort Lauderdale, Museum of Contemporary Art North Miami, Spectrum Miami Art Basel, Cultural Council of Stewart and Lake Worth, Fritz Gallery. His video works have been premiered online by Troma, Spin Magazine, Flood Magazine, Office Magazine, Consequence of Sound, Noisy, and Vice. Now, over to you, Charlotte and Atesh.
Thank you, Heather. And Charlotte, are you here with me?
I am. Hi, Atesh.
How's it going?
All good. I promise this is not going to turn into me roasting you today. I'm really grateful. Thank you, Heather, for setting this up so nicely, this conversation. We're both really excited to be here to discuss something that's been on my mind for a really long time. You know, often when I do talks on my own research into feminist photography, the audiences are majority female. And, you know, I've been asking myself a lot of questions around this, you know, why that is, and questioning my own feminism and interpretation of it, I guess. And so thank you for also stepping up and being willing to first of all classify your work in this way, but also to be here to sort of defend it, as it were. But yeah, I'll hand over to you to start our conversation.
Yeah, and we're going to go, I'm going to take the lead on a few of the beginning of the slides, and then Charlotte is going to take over, but we'll just have a conversation within, and then hopefully more conversations after. So when asking the question, can men create feminist photography, feminist art? I think it'd be good to have a common understanding of what is feminist art. And I know just what Heather started her intro with, that's difficult in every way the question is looked at. I tried to find a simple definition, and this is by English art historian Marie Vickles, and it's an idea that a work of art could portray the power, independence, quality, dignity, and identity of women. And she, in a lecture, asked, what is feminist art? Art that is produced by women, or is it the content that is feminist or not feminist? And I'd like to go from that to a quote from Bell Hooks, which is social activist Bell Hooks. Feminists are made, not born, or feminism is for everyone. And that's the stance that I would like to take, and I feel comfortable within myself. And these 2 images that I showed here, they're just early examples of what has been considered feminist art. I don't have the dates, unfortunately, with me. I thought I did, but this one on the left, let me see, the Villa of Mysteries in Pompeii. This is from a unknown artist, but believed to be a woman because it depicts a secret cult initiation that only women had access to. And this is like 870 BC or something. And the one on the right is a sculpture of Bernini's head of Costanza. And it was a little bit outside of what sculptures were showing at the time, and not just depicting classic beauty. Here's a quote that says, "Her hair is disheveled, her dressing gown is wrinkled, unbuttoned, hangs loosely across her breasts. One can imagine that her makeup is long gone. Costanza looks out with parted sensual lips and seems a bit dazed, and let's see, didn't capture only beauty, but vulnerability, intimacy, possibly anger and frustration, because this was at the end of an affair with this woman." I think we can go on to the next slide. I have some quotes from Audre Lorde, American writer, feminist, womanist, librarian, and civil rights activist. Her viewpoints are more detailed and powerful than Beckinsale's definition I mentioned earlier, but the core ideas are similar. Here we have, there's always someone asking you to underline one piece of yourself, whether it's Black, woman, mother, dyke, teacher, etc. That's the piece that they need to key into. They want to dismiss everything else. Jansen, would you like to jump in at all?
Yeah, well, it's funny. I find myself sitting here and experiencing a very strange sensation of being a woman with a certain amount of power, speaking about, definitions of feminism with a man at a feminist, congress organized by and for women. But, joking aside, what do we do with power? Knowledge, as the old adage goes, is power. Now, what we're looking at now in terms of trying to define and situate ourselves as feminists is in a way, for me, a knowledge that's predicated on sort of a system of beliefs or constructed notions or ideas about how we categorize certain things, about how we relate to one another and define what we're doing, which in a way, it's it's been born of the patriarchy and a system which women haven't been included in and haven't been allowed to construct for themselves by themselves. So I would almost contend and argue with you that the very act of trying to define what is feminist art or what is a feminist photograph is something we should do away with here and now. And perhaps the question we are going to ask ourselves, like as we proceed through this conversation, is what is our mission as feminists? As feminist photographers, people working with photography that's our most powerful visual medium at our disposal today around the world. What's our goal? What's our future? What should the purpose of feminism with regards to photography be? And photography, obviously, since the kind of inception of a lot of these belief systems that we're looking at now and these definitions, its role has been very concrete in terms of the patriarchy and very explicitly involved in categorizing and defining, dividing and conquering. How can we move beyond that? If we're living now in a state of feminism that is intersectional, as Aldeide mentioned in her introduction, as we've heard in the last presentation, and indeed as Heather sort of introduced now, shouldn't we be moving beyond these ideas of gender, if gender is a prison? One of the kind of major, I guess, moments of progress in feminism, particularly pushed through by photography in the 21st century, has been to sort of break down these gender norms. So why are we continuing to kind of use these archaic and rather Manichaean sort of oppositions, male, feminine, can a man make, can a woman be? So that's kind of what I want to, discuss with you further as we look at some of these examples that are all really pertinent and sort of challenge this in different ways.
Yeah, I'd like that too. And my definition or my understanding of these keep growing as I am forced to ask these questions to myself. And, there's always just a wide range of understanding, both in the artist, but also the consumer, the viewer. And, people are in different levels of their education, age, understanding. So, I hope that some of these questions do become outdated, but it's good to have them pose to people of all different, kind of levels or routes or positions of their understanding. And what you just said, I think, plays into this bottom left quote, I think, well, but all forms of oppression are interrelated, and one cannot talk about feminism without acknowledging race, class, gender expression, sexuality, and any other markers of one's identity, which I think is sort of what you're getting at. We can't just use one word and think that that represents something in particular, because they are all interrelated, and one can't really stand without the other, and the other, and the other.
Absolutely. And I think, I wouldn't want to sit here today, and as I'm sure you wouldn't want to do, and define what feminist photography is. That would be completely contradictory to the purposes of feminism in the first place. So what we're going to try to do here is open up this question a bit more and kind of figure out why this is such a contentious subject, actually, still, because it is. And when we look at these quotas and these numbers and these figures, there's always a skew. So why, what is our goal? As I said, what is our mission? How are we going to overcome this in a way?
Yeah.
I think we can go to the next slide, right?
Yes. Since we're talking about feminist photography, and I'm a photographer, I'm going to show a few contemporary photographers that inspire me. And I've noticed that all of my favorite photographers, the ones whose careers I follow on social media, tend to be all women. Some people like Elizaveta Pordino, Lulani Medina, Carlotta Guerra. And I just noticed that this is in contrast to my favorite film directors, which I noticed are all primarily men. And I was trying to think of why that would be. And I think that's because I found my favorite films and directors at a young age before identifying as a feminist. And my favorite photographers, I started learning about as I became a photographer after I started identifying as a feminist. And I think that returns to Bell Hook's point of feminists are made, not born. So I think that's the reason a lot of my favorite photographers kind of follow certain tenets, while my favorite directors are before I had any of those notions. And then here in these photos, we have Juno Calypso. I think there's an artist I actually took out, but the middle one is not someone we're going to be talking about today, which is Elizaveta Pordino. Then I have Ren Hang here as well. We can go to the next slide. So this is Juno Calypso, and Charlotte has a relationship with her, and she's been featured in her book Girl on Girl, which I actually have here with me. I'm going to just show it for a moment. This is Charlotte's book Girl on Girl, and just on the back cover we have Juno Calypso, and also within the book. And it's just one of my favorite photographers. And Juno Calypso is a British photographer whose works directly subvert the male gaze. She's usually the subject of her own work, and her works are intended to be statements and satires of contrived femininity. We can go to the next slide. And I have a quote here. I'll just read the top one. But absorbed in her own reflection, surrounded by shiny pink surfaces and lace, she is trying to live up to absurd, contrived notion of femininity. And Charlotte, would you like to speak some about Juno?
Yeah, so I've known Juno for a number of years, and she lives not far away from me in London, and she's been explosively successful with her work, but though she works very slowly and dedicates herself to projects that kind of reveal themselves over a long period of time, which I think in itself is quite an interesting way of working and countering the system that we find ourselves in today, where there's this onslaught of images. What I find interesting about the example of Juno as a feminist photographer is, especially of this kind of new guard of, say, or so-called third wave of feminist photography, is her interactions with capitalism, actually, which we're going to come on to discuss a little later in terms of the possibilities and maybe the obstacles facing feminist photography. But a lot of her work kind of focuses on the idea of the way that capitalism affects women and women's bodies very specifically, or is targeted and used against us in a way, both in terms of the competitiveness, in the way that we're expected to buy products to sort of counteract undesirable aspects of ourselves, remove hair, color our hair, change our appearance with makeup, and all the rest of it. So as we see in this picture, part of an early series, the honeymoon suite that she photographed in a love hotel, that she, stayed in a room by herself for a couple of days and nights, just taking these photographs. It's speaking really about the industry around romance and how that's used against women and how that's marketed against women. So yeah, I think a really interesting example for you to use, and I can trace some of the influences in your work in terms of there's this slight eeriness as well, and that's like, she's got that satirical horror aspect to her work that I think you quite appreciate, right?
I do, yeah. We can go, sorry, next slide, but we can keep. Another person I brought up is Dana Tripp, and this is an editorial photographer and music video director. And this is not someone that I have been able to find any interviews with relating to feminism directly. And that's why I want to bring it up, because again, is it just people that are trying to create particular feminist work, or can it be, if something be viewed as feminism by the viewer without the artist explicitly framing their work in that? And I think her subjects are exclusively women, and even when it's for a publication like Playboy and there's a sexuality as an element, so is the power, mystery. The images are stretched out, distorted, sometimes beautiful, sometimes unsettling. We can go to the next slide. And this is the top one's a quote about a series of work that she was in, exploring the intersections of science fiction and feminism whilst shining a spotlight on the LGBTQIA+ and POC communities. And this is just, again, a photographer that's very inspirational to me, and I just found a lot of power in it and a lot of thought-provoking, like I said, distortions, though, again, I see it as a feminist photographer and work. I have not found any evidence or proof that she does. So I want to mention someone that does not explicitly define themselves as. Charlotte, any input?
Yeah, and I think the examples that I'm going to come on to discuss shortly with you are all by men or people who identify as men, and none of them classify their work outrightly as feminist. So again, it's this question of who is defining feminism and for who? What is the functionality of these works? And why are people afraid, in general, to perhaps ascribe this term? I've also had feminist artists that don't necessarily want to label their work in that way. So again, how these are kind of things that we're grappling with, I guess, in terms of labeling and categorizing, which again, I believe are kind of patriarchal conceits, and to leave things more open-ended might be possibly a more feminist approach in of itself. But it's interesting that you raised this question about, how do we define works as feminist? Is it us saying that we think this is? And what I'm going to identify in the works I want to discuss shortly are qualities, or sensibilities that I think align with what I understand as feminism or feminist practice. We can
Next slide, yeah.
So I brought up, obviously you can't do a talk about the gays and about feminist photography without referring to our sort of godmother, Laura Mulvey. And I think why I wanted to raise this particular quote is that I find myself, as a writer, very concerned with the possibilities of actually pushing back against the patriarchy, when the very language we have, in order to express ourselves, has come from this long patriarchal history. And as we've seen, for example, in Marie and Luce's book that was spoken about in the previous presentation, we're having to do so much work now, put so much effort into filling that void, to bridging that gap. Everything we know, the words we use, the language, the way we write, the format of presentations like these, the way we take pictures, the way we spectate pictures, it comes from the patriarchy. So is it even possible, particularly now as sort of capitalism, I guess, becomes the dominant ideological force in our world, is it possible, considering how much that capitalism is against women, is it even possible to create a feminist work as a woman? As Audre Lorde would say, says famously, the master's tools will never dismantle the master's house. So how can we actually do this ourselves? So if even as women we're kind of faced with this problematic proposition about making work. We can go to the next slide now. Thank you. So Atesh, I think we want to talk through a few examples, right, of men who we are identifying as feminist practitioners, or whose works, as I said previously at least, seem to align with the ideas of feminism.
Yes, so I'll start with mine, and then we're going to go on to some other male photographers. And I did like asking myself, why or how is my work feminist? And it was, I think, brought up to me that it is before I definitely identified it as that. And I feel like I have made feminist work and artwork that is true to the LGBTQ persons that it represents, but I wanted to ask how, and I wanted to see why I felt comfortable in these spaces. And I think that's because I've always had a relationship with the subject, and a lot of these people are my friends or the communities that I'm involved in. And it's more that I'm documenting people that I know and that exist, and trying to keep things as objective as possible. I think it's the reason any person of any race, nation, gender, denomination can make a documentary about any other, and it's not inherently exploitative or seen as cultural appropriation, while fictional art under those same parameters could easily be. I'm not taking dangerous liberties or stances. I'm adjusting the technical parameters of the gear I use, the lighting, the background. Maybe there's some direction to get the person comfortable or vulnerable. But I'm not creating the subject matter. It's there already. And we're meeting in the middle, which is the photo, the final edit. So when I'm working with a woman or a woman identifying the subject, I need to know them, understand them, ask them for their input, what they're comfortable with, not comfortable with them, and ask them to be themselves, whatever it is on that particular day. Give me one moment, please. Oh, and we're going to go into this a bit later in another slide, but I think it's also my experience of othering that has led me to my feminist principles and my interest in feminist art, being a Turkish American, son of immigrants, having a unique name, different cultural and religious backgrounds. And again, we'll bridge this into how that works, othering works into feminist art. We can go on to the next slide. Thanks. I'll start this one with a quote and then go into these works. But gender binary is a tool used by cisgender men to establish their own primacy at the expense of other genders, and that by embracing non-binary identities in all forms, feminists can challenge and dismantle a power structure that stifles every person's right to self-determination. And that's by Rowan Thompson. And I wanted to bring these two up because I think these would be kind of like a simple, possibly contrived step or look at gender fluidity. If it had been me, the photographer, that had chosen these outfits and these personas, but these are actually, so I'll explain. On the right, this is a Kevin, a friend of mine, and this is a character that he created a long time before I ever knew him, named Bussy Holiday. And this is an exploration of a female drag star, a persona he takes on to do drag that he identifies as a she. So this is not me exploring outside the nine binary using two people as vessels. This is me, noticing this performer and this character, Bussy Holiday, and saying, would you like to come to the studio? Can I take a photo of you? And I took a photo of this. And I am not the one that created the kind of the gender fluidity that is being explored here that was created by this person, Kevin, and what that character means to them. And on the left, this is Leah. And this was during kind of a large factory style photo shoot party that I was having. And I asked Leah to go through a whole slew of outfits, find what spoke to her. And she tried on many different things. And finally, she came to me in this outfit, in this persona. And this is what she felt strong and comfortable with, like in. And this has turned out to be one of my strongest portraits. And so again, this is not me exploring these possibly non-binary or fluid possibilities within a person. This is, again, just documenting something that is happening. We can go. Well, Charlotte, did you have any input on the last two?
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting how you complicate the question of gender, you know, in your own work. And I think you raise a really important point, which for me, you know, one of the things that could indicate a feminist sensibility or a feminist practice is the process itself of making the image. You know, historically, men have, in photography, have had a point and shoot type approach where, you know, Susan Sontag spoke about the sort of implicit violence in that act, but it's also this idea of disengagement or detachment from the subject. And I think that women in photography have really pioneered a different approach, a collaborative approach that's more like a dialogue or an exchange, you know, by recognizing the inherent imbalance of power and the skewed power dynamic when you take a picture of somebody and you kind of have authorship of somebody else's image. So kind of acknowledging and recognizing that has been something that I think has really been foregrounded by women photographers, particularly in the second half of the 20th century and in the last 20 years. So yeah, I'm grateful to you for bringing that up, and that's one of the things that I have been considering in looking at work by men. You know, how is the image made? Does that reflect those kind of collaborative approaches that try to upend that power dynamic and shift that kind of idea of you know, being behind the camera?
Next slide. And these will be the last two of my works that I'll show. This is Leaf on the left and Eden on the right. And these are both friends of mine, dark, intense, both musicians, and their music goes into dark places. Leaf on the left, I decided to collaborate on some photos with, and we spoke a little bit and just openly just saying, you know, let's see what comes out that day. And she came to where we shot the photos in this homemade mask, in this kind of nun-looking outfit with black contacts that covered her entire eye. It's hard to see in this photo, but this is, you know, who she is, how she wants to be seen. She's a very kind of secretive and mysterious person, doesn't have much social media presence. And I just, you know, caught her in the way she wanted to express herself on that particular day. On right, this was just a spontaneous just capture of Eden at a show. She was playing guitar, her own music, devil horns. None of this was my stylistic choice. It's just a Polaroid that I caught, and I feel, you know, that it just really does show a true part of her essence, and she felt that way as well. And yeah, those are the last pieces of my own work. Charlotte, if you have any other input there.
Again, I think it's, you know, it's important to underline here that kind of, you know, your proximity as well to the subjects. You know, so often, certainly in my research for Girl on Girl, and again in my most recent research, it seems to me that men in general approach the work from a distance, and women prefer, in general, speaking general, at least feminist artists prefer to use this kind of subjects, people that they are comfortable with, that they have trust with. You know, trust is a word that comes up time and time again, and I think that's something that's important to you in your work, and which makes it inherently feminist in its approach and methodology.
Next slide.
Next slide, yeah, thank you.
We're both going to speak about Ren Hang. I just wanted to mention it just one more time as one more photographer that really inspires me. And his work is often seen as very graphic and comfortable for the viewer. and he captures the totality of weirdness of human experience, the sexuality, perversion, but also the power. Next slide. And I just want to include kind of something humorous that I just think ties into what makes his work feminist. And this has to do with, I didn't include it here, but there is a series of photos he has of people urinating on things. And in a question from a photographer, I'll just read the quote. "What's with all the pee in your photos?" the reporter asked, perhaps hoping for a lurid answer. Ren had none. "I'd like to portray every organ in fresh, vivid, and emotional way," he said. In other words, urinating isn't scandalous or erotic. It's a biological reality, at once amusing and a fact. And I think that his comfort was showing all aspects of just the human being, and something that can seem pornographic or lurid or scandalous in a way that is just kind of, objective, just ties into feminist work and feminism, even if it's not about a man or a woman in particular.
Yeah, and I mean, I told you this already, but I actually interviewed Ren Hang. For those who don't know, was a Chinese photographer who died in 2017. And suspected suicide, and at that point was really kind of just blowing up. But it's interesting what's happened to his legacy since, because most of his work at that point had been done online. I mean, there was one book published by Taschen, but it'd be interesting to see what happens to the legacy of this artist now. And actually, the first time I saw an exhibition of Ren Hang, I was in Tokyo, and I experienced an earthquake. There was literally, and the gallery was on the 5th floor of a building, and so it's really stuck with me, this experience of his work. And I think that the important point about Ren Hang is that feeds into feminist practice is that this right to self-objectification, and I think that's where the intersectionality comes into it, because in terms of Ren Hang using exclusively sort of Asian, particularly sort of East Asian bodies and model subjects in his work continuously, was also, a way of, the way of depicting these bodies, the nudity, embracing them as, first and foremost flesh. I think that's something that we see happening in a lot of recent feminist practice, in terms of the way that nudity in bodies can be used, and that we have, for those of us who have experienced othering and had our sort of subjectivities so violently erased and taken away from us, that this right to self-objectification, to display your body in any way that you want unashamedly, is really quite poignant. We can go to the next slide, thank you. So I wanted to kind of just put it to the audience, really, who gets to define themselves as a feminist photographer? Why are people making art that may be seen as feminist? How is that work being made? And what is the subject of the work? These are all really important questions that I think we need to ask of work. And I can understand why feminist photographic practice, or any sort of feminist space, has become so closely guarded, and why we're sort of reluctant to let men into that space, since we've had to fight so hard to get here. We're still learning and paving our way as female image makers, and recognizing ourselves as female spectators as well. And so to allow men to sort of come into that space, it's difficult, and I can see why there's a lot of trepidation and why it's indeed controversial. Nonetheless, I think that inclusivity and diversity being some of the kind of key principles of feminism, that means that we should open up our definitions and sort of welcome in, bring in more people to sort of represent these ideas. So one of the artists, and I know we're running out of time, so I'm going to just dash through a couple of these examples just in case we have any questions at the end. I can see Heather's popped back up as well, so that must mean time is running up. So I really wanted to talk about Shakeith. Do we need to see more penises? This was the question I wanted to ask Shakeith. I mean, I think he's got this incredible work where he created these sort of glass sculptural penises that were illuminated and hang down in space. And I mean, I bring him up as an example. Recently performed at the Biennial and in New York at the Performer Biennial. You know, his emotional, psychological investigation of the inner lives of Black men, of the psyche, of the way that representation or lack thereof affects our psyche and how we understand ourselves. I find that so fundamental in feminism, and I think there's a really big, you know, alignment here with what he is doing and the way that he's presenting vulnerability and the emotional lives of men and specifically Black men and those histories and prejudices, you know, and how photography can be a sort of form of healing. So, you know, I think that there's an exchange going on there. So you can go to the next slide. And just feel free to chip in if you can get a word in whilst I'm going through these. And so Caleb Azuma Nelson is a photographer and a writer, a novelist who actually writes in a very photographic way, you know, and I think it's interesting how he's using the word as image, but also his portraits, you know, he says he thinks of portraits as a conversation, which relates to what you were saying about your own work as well, Archers, and you know, the freedom in feeling seen, specifically him as a Black man in the UK. This is a portrait of his sister. And I think there's just so much tenderness in these images, and that I identify that as a quality that is, or could be quite feminist. We can go to the next slide. So Leonard again, I mean, we talked about othering and how experiences of being othered in society could lead us to share empathies and have solidarity with people, you know, not only women. And I think that's why many of the artists that I'm drawn to do come from queer perspectives or are men of color who, you know, may just have experienced, you know, being hawked out in space or being excluded in the way we have as women. So Leonard is a Chinese Buddhist minority growing up as a queer person in Indonesia, obviously experienced a great deal of exclusion and bullying, both within his own family, that was quite a conservative family, and also in society. Sort of led him to leave the country and move to the US in age 18, where he married. And then his work has subsequently become a sort of process of reconciliation with his family. So again, I think this phototherapy, you know, that Joe Spence and has sort of propagated, that's I find its roots in that feminist sort of conversation and that feminist type of way of making art. And this is again the subject here, and I find it important, the subject, that if we are calling artists to amend feminists, like what they're making work about. So I feel more comfortable, at least for now, discussing men that make work about their own experiences or about other men, about masculinity. I think it becomes more complex when we start to speak about female subjects and to represent those. So this is his dad and his trophy. So just a real stand up of like conventional masculinity and how sort of absurd it is. So if you move.
I was going to play off that. Just you had mentioned when we were speaking last week the kind of photographic fantasy and play as healing, and you know that's what this photo is about. But I think that is a lot of what the subjects I'm drawn to seem to be doing within, you know, performers and in the drag space. It's kind of exploring what they want to be, how they want to be portrayed, and, you know, often telling me what they want to be seen as, you know. So that I do see that aspect of fantasy and play for healing that you mentioned here, and how that ties into othering and kind of healing beyond.
Yeah, because the organizers are encouraging me to open it up to the question period, but maybe there's still a way to kind of fold in some of your examples.
We can go for it with the questions, and we can continue maybe to move through the slides just to show some, any way we can sort of look at the pictures themselves and sort of, you know, perhaps you can see what some of the things that we're talking about. We're just going to be, you know, this is just to further develop our points. But this is such a huge topic. I was never going to cover it in 45 minutes. So thank you, Heather. Yeah, there are questions.
So, well, both of you have said so many poignant things, and you know, and you're not entirely on the same page, right? I mean, I see moments of that are not as explicit as they could be, but moments where you're not quite in sync about this. You know, Charlotte, you've said that, you know, the problem with definitions at the outset, right? And that maybe we should try to get away from that. Whereas Atesh, you begin with a definition, and you know, or even, and I really, I'll just say personally, I really appreciate, Atesh, your desire to be open, to be a feminist. But I wonder about some of the assumptions, which have to do, for example, with the fact that it's not self-evident, right? Like, these photographs are not self-evidently feminist. So no matter what the intention of the photographer is, the mindset, how is it that the photograph in circulation in the world is feminist?
I mean, I think Heather, that's a great question. And that's one of the reasons we're here, right? That's one of the reasons we need discussions, we need books, we need context around images, because images float and live without any context ascribed to them now. And equally, I agree, like, but you know, any photograph you could say the same about, you know, how or in what way is it feminist? I mean, I began getting into this subject in the first place in sort of, in relation to this kind of era of feminist selfies and, you know, these sexualized, self-objectified, as I mentioned earlier, that kind of self-objectification that became a really, really core part of a new feminist wave. Seeing those pictures out of context, how do you differentiate them from any other, you know, from a porn, from a fashion magazine shoot? It's all, you know, all feeds into each other. And again, what I said at the beginning about the problem of inhabiting these spaces is that ultimately everything gets subsumed by this dominant, you know, whatever the dominant system is, which is capitalism, which is, in my mind, pretty much patriarchy. Yeah, and I think we wanted to disagree, right, Atish? We wanted to.
I wanted to learn, and I want to defend a little bit, but it's the kind of thing that I just think, just like with any, I mean, especially with the way media, social media, and everything moves these days, and kind of how fast things are forgotten or change. I am completely open to someone looking at a piece of mine and saying that's not feminist, and I will say okay. And if someone were to say, well, your photography or your art is not, I will say okay. I am learning what it means to be a feminist artist through these conversations, and you know, if I need to defend a piece of work someday, I hope I can do that eloquently. But the core of what I'm trying to get at, and it's kind of, you know, it's I think there's a quote, it's like learn the rules so you can break them, so so you can work outside of them. So I feel like I need to learn the rules of what has been established in the past before I can easily step outside and let things be, whether they are or not feminist, or positively portraying a certain group of people. Heather, would you like to?
Well, and the ease may never come, right?
Yeah.
Building off of that, let me give you a question from the audience, from Andrea Herrera, who wonders, what is the difference between representing feminist themes and having a feminist art practice? She says, for me, the question is, can it only be considered feminist art because of the aesthetic results based on visual references and theory?
I don't think that's the case. I think some of it comes down to intention and representation, and I think, I mean, that a lot of it, I really think, to me, it's so personal that it's kind of if the subject believes that it is, so not even the creator, me, but if the subject believes that this is a feminist piece, then I think I can agree that it is. And I don't think it has to be a certain kind of aesthetic or certain kind of visual elements captured or shown. It's really coming, from the subject, the woman or woman identifying person, or if it's if I'm working with the LGBTQ community, it's like, does this represent what you are trying to represent and what you see yourself as and who you are? And if it does, then I think it does. And I mean, I don't think every person that sees my work is going to have a conversation with the subject and ask, well, did you feel like this was feminist or not? And can I agree with you that it is or not? But I think that's where I am comfortable with it, is if the subject I'm working with feels that it is represented in the way they want to and that it is feminist, then I can agree with that.
Another audience member wants to know if this discussion is similar to one about being an ally, not something one claims, but something that is conferred. You guys want to weigh in on that? Charlotte, any?
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, I see these things anyway, just as we said at the beginning, it's in, everything in my perspective as a feminist is completely intersectional. And I think, race, class, all of these things feed into each other, and you can't discuss one without discussing the other. And so it's absolutely like being an ally. I think that the problem is that we don't yet have some kind of term. I guess there should be something out there that allows men to identify as that. I think there's so much reluctance around men or male identifying people to actually align themselves with this cause and with this movement, because they don't want to call themselves feminists, and maybe we don't want them to call themselves feminists, but there's no such term as that. And so maybe that's something that we need to think about and bring forth, so that we can widen this movement, because I just feel, particularly in photography and in contemporary art, in the fields that I work in and do research in, it feels like speaking in an echo chamber sometimes, in that it's great to be in environments that are for and pro women and led by women, but why are men not coming into those spaces where they can actually experience, the reverse of control and the reverse of power, and learn, like you're saying you are, Atish, about these subjects. There's something there that's going on, that's that in the outside world, when we go back into space where of mixed genders, how much of these theories actually being recognized and playing out in the real world? How can we push to make real changes and difference outside of these safe spaces for discussion?
Well, on the subject of gender fluidity, which I think both of you raise in the works you show and the comments you've made, there is a question here about clarification. So does feminism, which includes gender fluidity, blur the power, independence, quality, and dignity of women? And then is this a male perspective? It's a tough one.
Ouch. Yeah, that is, I mean, I personally, I don't see it as I see power as a male thing, as a, like, we use this, but it's bandied around a lot, this word empowered, and we're all about empowering, and like, who wants power? Like, I don't want power. I certainly don't want to, I may have experienced it briefly, as I said at the beginning of this talk, when I momentarily considered sort of chopping Atish down in this discussion, but I think that I don't think that sharing space is blurring of power. I think that there's strength in numbers. I think that the more that we can include and welcome in and kind of align ourselves with each other, the better.
I think that strategy of sharing and collaboration, which you've both talked about, is something really positive. We've reached our time limit now, so we're going to actually have to say goodbye. So thank you to everybody who's been with us. Thank you especially to Charlotte Natesh for your conversation and your thoughts. To all of you out there, please tune in for the afternoon sessions for the panels that are both online and in person at the Pérez Art Museum here in Miami. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks a lot.
Thank you so much for those wonderful conversations. We will come back in 30 minutes after a break. We have another link. See you soon in the afternoon session. Thank you.